Holland remembers the liberators. I'm Allison Smith. Welcome back to our special coverage of today's commemoration ceremonies. In this hour, Canadian soldiers who liberated Amsterdam return to a hero's welcome.
Canadians, thanks.
Some heartfelt words from Holland's younger citizens.
We didn't really know what the war would actually bring.
One woman's personal story of how she helped the war effort. More memories, highlights, and special reports about VE Day plus 50. Stay with us. We'll be back with all of this and more right after a brief news report.
Good evening from Calgary. I'm Dave Brindle. In the news today, it was a day of remembrance and gratitude in the Netherlands. 50 years ago today, Canadians liberated Holland in the final days of the Second World War in Europe. There were ceremonies all over the country. Canadian veterans returned to a hero's welcome. More than 7,000 Canadians died liberating the Netherlands from German occupation. At a ceremony in The Hague, Prime Minister Chrétien said they did not die in vain.
The price that our young people paid 50 years ago has brought some very positive result here. And the fact that the people here remember so well their contribution.
Coming up, News World's coverage of the 50th anniversary of VE Day. That's after this.
During the enemy's last hours of control in northern Holland, a spirit of wild fiesta reigns in towns and villages freed by the Canadian drive. Behind are the grim years of famine and oppression. The bands play and the people welcome the dawn of a free new day. Old Dutch veterans of colonial wars parade to celebrate liberation. The Dutch standard is again raised over what was the palace of a British monarch of the House of Orange, King William III. Hollanders hail the harbingers of freedom as town after town is emancipated. Proclamations are read and posted, announcing the resumption of normal government. The years of slavery for a peace-loving people have reached their termination. Grimmer scenes are enacted as collaborators are rounded up. Marked Hollanders who trafficked with the enemy meet with horror the day of retribution. No consideration or mercy is shown the people who sold their honor for a handful of now useless Reichsmarks. Joy and anger in northern Holland mingle in a mighty crescendo as V-Day approaches and the time of final peace looms close on the horizon.
Among the many memorial services held in Holland this week was one held in Holten, where many Canadian soldiers are buried in the local cemetery. We have two reports on the ceremonies there, the first from the CBC's Anne McMillan.
The memorial service at the Canadian Cemetery at Holten was especially poignant for two Canadian sisters. Their father lies buried here. George Buttimer died just 1 month before the end of the war. This is the first time Sandra Dickey from Charlotte, New Brunswick, and Sheila Wood from Orillia, Ontario, have visited his grave. Sheila was just 2 months old when her father was shot by a German sniper. Sandra was 4.
We thought it would be very emotional. We have cried every day since we've been in Holland, especially because of the love of the Dutch people for us. When we got on the bus and saw the sign, "Thank you, boys," that started us crying. And when most of these boys are 19 and 20 years old, they were just boys. It gives a new meaning, you know. And I wonder, would our 19 and 20-year-old Canadian boys do this today for another country, you know?
But the words on his tombstone.
All he had hoped for.
All he had, he gave to save mankind.
That was his attitude. And to think every Christmas Eve the children light a candle on every grave in this cemetery. And on this day they lay flowers. We did not know that. The Dutch teach their children very well to remember.
It's worth
Yes,
coming
yes.
for sure.
In a way, it's our way of saying we're proud of our father for what he did.
Veterans of 1,000 bloody skirmishes in pretty country lanes, joined by thankful Dutch whose warmth for these aging warriors never seems to dim.
This, my friend, is buried here. And we have a man right there, Michaud, is buried there.
How many guys are you looking for, you figure?
Just 2 on this list. I have them on the list here.
Have you found them?
Yep, right here. There's Vincent McNeil and Paul O'Donnell's down in row 8 down there.
Some of them were mostly all young, weren't they? 19, 20, 21. It's a shame. But
how old were you?
I joined at 18. I was the same age.
I took photographs in 1948, but the graves were different in those days.
Yeah. So sad, you know.
It's a
You would have
moment
been-
of memory.
That's right, you know. It's, seeing after 50 years you're coming back, you know, it's very emotional.
I thank you for freedom.
And we thank the Dutch people for having us.
Now, Mrs. Painter, where was your husband born?
In Ottawa.
And Mrs. Painter, where were you born?
In Amsterdam.
So this is a war romance here.
It definitely was.
Is it still a romance?
It still is a romance after 50 years.
So you are Dutch Boy Scouts? Yes. And why do you come to this cemetery each year?
Well, I think it's some kind of a tradition. I think we owe it to the people who gave their lives for our freedom.
How long will you do this? How long will the people of this town do this?
I don't know. I think forever.
Every year, Dutch school children lay flowers on the graves of young Canadians who came to their country and never went home.
Sonny Short.
What these men did 50 years ago is a legend to the young here.
One left. You're lucky.
Why did you put the flowers on the grave?
That's the Canadians, hoe heet zeg je dat? Thanks to Canadians.
Do you do it because the teacher tells you to do it or because you want to do it?
Wat want te doen. Even zo uit.
As we've mentioned already, these next few days are a time for solemn remembrance. But also, Don, there is a spirit of joy in some of this, the joy of liberation and peace as well.
Well, that's right, Allison, because it's today. Today is Liberation Day in the Netherlands, but many of the events actually got underway yesterday, continued overnight. For the Dutch, May the 4th is National Memorial Day, a day to remember those who died, including the Canadians who came to liberate them.
This, my friend, is buried here. And we have a man right there, Michaud, is buried there.
Some of them were mostly all young, weren't they? 19, 20, 21. It's a shame.
Why do you come to this cemetery each year?
Well, I think it's some kind of a tradition. I think we owe it to the people who gave their lives for our freedom.
How long will the people of this town do this?
I don't know. I think forever.
I wrote the day after, or the day the telegram came. It didn't say that our father was deceased. It just said he was hit with a bullet. And I wrote, Dear Daddy, I hope you come home, I suppose. But now I'm glad I saw it all for myself. Yes. Where it is and it's We're yes. In a way, it's our way of saying we're proud of our father for what he did.
Kunnen lering trekken uit de historie.
Friends and foes alike can learn from history, from everything that visibly obstructed liberty, helped by the effect of time. In Germany as well, many in the post-war period have honestly been willing to face their own history. In this confrontation with the truth is the key for reconciliation.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, the story of the Dutch resistance. We'll go behind the lines with people who fought a dangerous underground war.
As the offensive to liberate northern Holland gets underway, armor of the 4th Canadian Division breaks out of the Cleves area in an all-out drive for the North Sea. Blasted roads are hastily repaired with brush to allow the war of movement to continue in high gear. The tanks advance so fast, the infantry are a day behind, and people in liberated towns are left to celebrate alone. A concentration camp at Bassor, Germany is overrun. The guard left in a hurry the night before our forward tanks rolled through. The liberated prisoners are officers of Yugoslavia, France, and Poland. Their commanding general receives instructions as the internees parade to celebrate their freedom. The first town across the German border to be captured is the communication center of Neuenhaus. Fleeing Jerry's leave the railway station absolutely intact. All rolling stock is in perfect condition and ready to move. The lads take a joyride on a Speedy fueled with German petrol. Meanwhile, south of Arnhem, 5.5s go into action. The second prong of the Canadian attack meets much stiffer resistance. The town of Zutphen is defended to the last by Hitler Youth paratroopers. The infantry have a job cut out for them in mopping up. It is attended to in a thorough fashion. Fanatical snipers left behind by the retreating enemy cause a lot of trouble. Native Hollanders, seeing our troops, thought the war was over. Senseless sniping teaches them differently. The last sight of a dying mad dog is dangerous, but his final hope is going up in smoke.
For 5 bitter years they suffered, humiliated, brutalized, dispirited. Holland living and dying under Nazi occupation. Then, 1945, the Canadians fight their way in. The Germans surrendered. Liberation at last. The sweet taste of freedom.
50 years after VE Day, Holland remembers the liberators.
It took more than Allied soldiers to drive the Germans from Holland. The Dutch fought their own war, an underground war of resistance. And many resistance fighters paid the price for defying German rule. Capture meant death. Anne Macmillan has the story of two heroes who survived.
There's still heroes here, the men and women of the Dutch resistance. Job Abink is being honored for exceptional bravery. He was 28 and did everything possible to end the German occupation. As underground commander of Eastern Holland, he blew up bridges, hid Allied airmen, and saved Jews.
We tried to do something against it, but it was very, very dangerous. And I lost many, many friends.
Nanetta Polsky was a friend who survived. A key member of Abank's unit, she shared the danger and the conviction.
I felt very strongly that nobody had the right to invade a peaceful country and then start murdering people and taking Jews away and putting their foot down. I had to resist that.
25,000 people worked in the Dutch resistance. In secret hideouts, they forged identity cards which helped Jews escape deportation. The Allies used information supplied by the underground to launch attacks.
Dan klinkt die hol, dat is een gat onder. En dan was het ook verraden.
The very bravest, like Job Waltman, hid Allied airmen. It was a crime punishable by death.
Om erin te komen.
When he tells Dutch school children what he did in the war, they listen fascinated.
Zo'n wagen.
Waltman was 14 and acted as a courier, shepherding fugitive airmen to safety in his home. He still lives in the place which became known as the submarine base because it hid so many underground.
We didn't have the only hide place below, there were more hiding places. Because you never knew in the house what could happen.
One night, the unthinkable happened. A German soldier searched the house.
If not, then this was another one.
But he failed to spot an American flyer who had left his hiding place and was sitting in the living room.
He must be the stupid German I ever met. Or the brightest one. Because if he had spotted us and would have taken action, I don't think he would have gone out alive.
The first task that was given to me was watching out of a window to see if somebody was coming.
Nanetta Polsky wasn't scared then, but today, some memories make her blood run cold.
I, in my nurse's uniform, with 2 hand grenades in each pocket that I really didn't know what to do with. And suddenly we heard, "Halt!" And this German jumped out from behind a bush. And so we got off our bicycles, and I spoke very well German. And so he let us go. But it was a bit tight.
What would have happened if he had found the hand?
I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it because it would have been awful.
Heb jij dat?
Job Abink and his wife Bep also took enormous risks. Both were wanted by the Germans. Abink is deeply religious, a firm believer in the sanctity of human life. But the depravities of war enraged him. When he saw Jews being rounded up and sent off to concentration camps, something snapped, and he hunted down the Dutch traitor who was betraying Jewish families.
I sat on my bike and I went to him when he crossed the street, and then I shot him down. And that was very nice. I had a good feeling.
Abink escaped that time, but in October 1944 he was found with false papers. He was sent to a concentration camp. He nearly died there.
When you look 50 years back, would you do it again?
Oh, yeah. There's no problem.
I do it again, yes.
The eternal flame that burns in Apeldoorn keeps alive memories of the war. In the flickering light are the shadows of brave fighters from the Dutch resistance who gave their lives to free their country.
When the surrender terms were negotiated with the Germans, when the final papers were signed, and when the guns were handed over, Canadian General George Kitching was there, a witness to a key moment in the history of the war. He's returned to Holland for the VE Day celebrations, but earlier this week he talked with Peter Mansbridge. Their conversation took place in the same hotel conference room used 50 years ago for the surrender negotiations.
General, I know you've been back in this room many times over the last 50 years, but it must provoke certain emotions. How do you feel when you come back in this room?
It's almost as if they're ghosts, as if you are the German on the opposite side of the table, Peter. It was full of people then. Any movement, it was a very quiet room. Most of the windows are smashed, of course. But the reporters in here were along that wall behind you. And in spite of the fact that there were 30 Canadian reporters, they were quiet. They weren't noisy or unpleasant. They could have been, you know. They're waiting, and finally. So really, to me, any movement in here, you expect to see a German hat or one of ours.
First time you walked in and Blaskowitz was here, was there a sense of history on your part? Did you know you were entering a moment that would in fact be frozen in time?
No, I don't think so. I think we were so glad it was all over that I think any sense of history, I'm sorry, it wasn't with me then. It was with me within 2 weeks of it, when you saw the result of the meeting here, and you saw the Germans going out. Then I felt there was a real sense of me at that time.
So it must surprise you when you see pictures, as they do here, being sold with you in them there on one side of the table, as a moment in time, an end to what was a terrible period for the people of this country.
But in that particular one, I was mad because the interpreter, who is in the picture there, gave me a signal indicating that the German interpreter was not being really very kind about his remarks about the Canadians. And Charles Folks, of course, was looking more at the individual, and so he didn't get it. And finally I broke in and said, "Sir, you've got to, let's stop and hear what the Germans have really been talking about." And so this interpreter of ours then said that they'd been a little unkind. So Folks gave him a couple of shots in the arm, and that ceased from then on.
What was your sense of the German delegation when it was led by Blaskowitz sitting here in the room? What was your sense of how they were feeling?
They were broken men. Blaskowitz had been one of the great generals. He commanded an army group, rather like Montgomery at the end of the war. He commanded an army group in Poland. And from being about to be made a field marshal, he lost his field marshalship because, as you may know, Peter, he refused to separate the Jews from the other Poles. He said they'd fought very hard against us and they were good soldiers. So why destroy them? And so he was fired. And so, so from a period of greatness, he'd tumbled through some years of Hitler, going down and down and down. He'd had odd jobs thrown at him. And here he was surrendering 100,000 men. So he, to me, was, if he hadn't been fairly more robust, I think he would have collapsed, frankly. But he was a very robust person. So is his chief of staff.
But you could see the broken nature in his physique that day.
Yes, yeah. I think he wondered what on earth folks were going to be like. The Brits who reported on the whole series, were very unkind and said folks spoke in a quiet way instead of being demanding and hitting the table and so on. And that is just not folks. He got on quietly, and I think, frankly, that it was appreciated by the other side. Because once you start yelling at them, what do? They yell back. And instead it was conducted, I think, was about as decent a sort of ceremony as one could produce.
Was there tension in the room, or was it more relief?
There was tension once when Prince Bernhard told Blaskovitz that he wanted his men respected in the resistance, the Dutch resistance. Blaskovitz said, that would be very difficult because we don't know them all. And so Prince Bernhard said, well, they'll be wearing armbands, some with hats, but everyone is under my military discipline, and if they do anything wrong, they will be dealt with by me, very severely. So on that basis, Blaskovitz said, please go ahead. I will respect him, which he did.
Did you respect Blaskovitz?
I did, because I saw him when he was showing pictures of Belsen camp. He wouldn't believe when I told him, this was in his headquarters in Hilversum, 2 days after this, he wouldn't believe that this had happened. So I got an officer from him, sent him up to Belsen with a photographer who took pictures with the officer always in them. Then we took him back to Blaskovitz the next day. We gave him about 8 or 10 blow-ups, rather like these. And he looked at 3 of them and then just burst into tears and threw his head down on his arms and just shook. So I left. He said, how can Germans do this? I was told afterwards this is what he said. So he was a man of principle, I think, and shattered by seeing these hideous photographs.
Did you have any reason to doubt him on that score?
None at all, no. He I think, had a very severe face by this time. I think he was tired. A little tired of being told by somebody aged 40, and he is 56 or whatever the hell he was, and all his people were much older than we were. And I don't think he liked it. We were pipsqueaks. Folks commanded a corps, he'd commanded an army group, 100 years before. So he was no, I think he was quite sincere. His chief of staff, Paul Reichelt, I got to know very well in NATO, and he had a division much later in NATO. And he told me that Blaskovitz was very sincere man. And he said one thing was he was so impressed with the way the Canadians treated him and his soldiers, which is a compliment in many ways, although the Brits thought it was pretty stupid, but that was where it...
He ended up committing suicide, didn't he?
Yep.
Blaskovitz?
Because he was told he was going to be tried as a war criminal with the SS generals, and then of course he was the antipathy of these people.
It might sound odd to some people listening to you talk about the man who sat across from you, who'd been your enemy, with not only respect but a certain degree of sympathy. Is it odd to talk that way of?
I don't think it is, no. After all, they were beaten, thoroughly beaten, and they knew it. I think when a fellow is that far down, you try and give him a leg up. Even if it's a kick in the pants, but you help him. At least I would. No, I think to treat them as dirt, as some people tried to do, doesn't make friends in the end. It makes enemies again.
It's 50 years on now. Is it still important to remember?
I don't think it's important to remember the war. No, but I think it's important to remember the end of the war. That we were people when we were told no more shooting. I think, frankly, our fellows were. The reaction was, thank God for that. Thank God, I'm alive anyway. Thank God it's finished. And then the second one, I'm not kidding, was let's if we ever have another one, let's have the Germans on our side. They're too bloody good. That was a quite often spoken phrase when you went around and talked to friends.
When you think back to the war years, what memory do you take away from them mostly?
I'd say the loss of a hell of a lot of friends. And the making of a lot of friends, a tremendous number. I never would have met them had it not been for the war. So it's memories of people who were killed, and it's memories of great friends ever since.
General, we really appreciate talking to you today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being here. Thank you for bringing me out to Wageningen.
After a short break, some news from the home front. The story of a woman who made her contribution to the war effort on this side of the Atlantic.
My name is Corporal French L.T. I serve with the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, 27 Canadian Armoured. On VE Day, I was in the UK, having been sent back from Germany on an advanced battle course. I can assure you I didn't learn much from this because I had already been through most of it. And when we had got the news that the war was over, it was a very exciting time. The pubs were open, and I don't remember a hell of a lot about what went on after that.
Canadian blood on the beaches of Normandy, across the French countryside, through Belgium, and then spilled fighting Nazis in the mud of Holland. The survivors were welcomed as liberators. The dead are honored in sad silence.
50 years after VE Day, a part of Holland, forever Canadian.
The millions of Canadians who didn't go overseas also played a vital part in the war effort. Over the next few days, we'll meet some of those people, beginning with Terry Dovakin, who now lives in Milton, Ontario. During the war, she lived in Quebec, where she worked as an entertainer and as a volunteer nurse's aide.
Volunteer work was very important with a lot of the young women who weren't in factories and places like that. And when I started to work, I got into a troupe show with a girl that I worked with, was the pianist for this singing group. And we would go about once a week. We would get together and go out to the bases, the military bases mostly, in the area. And we would sing, and there was comedy and so on for them. And we had a good little singing group, as a matter of fact. We made recordings. We were called the Harmonettes. And so that was on the album. It wasn't an album cover like today you would have. It was just on the record itself. And it was just a vinyl recording. One of them was in the nurse's aid, in the hospitals, because a lot of the nurses had gone overseas or joined the Army Corps. And so we would go in 2 nights a week and help the nurses. And we did a lot of real nursing work. They trained us. I joined the St. John's Ambulance group, and they trained me, and they put an adorable uniform on me. I looked like a British nursing sister with the uniform, and I just loved it. I really enjoyed it. It was very exciting to get into a nice pair of stockings, if you can imagine. We used to paint our legs, you know, during the war, in the warmer months. We would draw black lines down the back of our legs, because in those days the stockings had the back had seams. You would tour at night, too, you know, after work. Get in a bus and go out to a base somewhere. And I remember distinctly working on 2 hours sleep very often. But it was exciting. That was the part that was, you know, about the war that was exciting, was this busyness that we had. And of course I do the nursing at night too after work. I met a lot of boyfriends. We used to have what we called, we'd have these dances And where I lived in Lachine was what they called a Manning Depot, and it's where all the young Air Forcemen from the, came and were, how will I say it, started in their military career. And they would be outfitted with their uniforms, and then they would get stationed to a base where they would get their training. But they would be there for about 2 weeks, and used to have these enormous dances with wonderful orchestras who would play all the swing music, you know, the Glenn Miller music and so on. And we would go under the auspices generally of some organization. You didn't sort of float in on your own. And it was just wonderful. And I met so many nice young men. You know, a lot of them would leave in the next week or so, but I kept in touch with a lot of them I met and wrote letters. And they were wonderful young men. They really were. I have very good memories of some, you know, a lot of fun, and they were very naive and innocent. I think most of them were. To me at that time, it was just all excitement, and we didn't have any idea that it would develop the way it did, or that it would be so long. No, it was supposed to be a quick thing. It would be over with pretty soon, and that's what most people felt.
When we come back, the story of a Canadian medical worker on the front lines in Holland.
We were in Holland on VE Day, and I guess it was a relief. We had a very busy time in Holland with Canadian casualties, and so I guess it was almost a relief to think that it was finally over. And we had a bonfire, and we had a supper, and the boys were looked after from the kitchen very, very well. And then the civilian Dutch people came and, you know, to thank us, and brought their children and said they would always tell their children how important it was to remember the Canadians. And so that was very nice of them to do.
As the day of reckoning for Nazi leaders approaches, a crushed Wehrmacht, unit by unit, hands in its arms and equipment. The eclipse of a mighty army is rapidly becoming a blackout. The tools of war which struck terror into many a hapless community are now impotent. Throughout Holland and Germany, they add to ever-growing scrap piles. Recaptured Shermans form part of the armor brought in by the surrendered army. The Jerrys themselves are detailed to do all the work of collecting and sorting out equipment in central dumps. With docility and subservience, they get on with the job. Into the Allied net also falls one of the worst of all Nazi murderers. Seyss-Inquart, former Chancellor of Austria, Deputy Governor of Poland, and then Reich Commissar to the Netherlands. Guarded by members of the 1st Canadian Army, the Holland hangman awaits the day when he, together with all arch criminals, will receive sentence from the tribunals of an outraged world.
For people who lived through it, memories of World War II never fade away. The people who served Canada overseas when they were young were marked forever by the experience, in good ways and bad ways. Here are the memories of Betty Campbell, a nursing sister who worked near the front lines as Canadian soldiers fought their toughest battles.
I joined in 42, and my home was in Saskatchewan, so I was out home, and so I did join there, and it was, I guess it was just something that we wanted to do, and it was an experience that nurses, something new, I suppose, and we didn't really know what the war would actually bring. We just could read about it, but I think joining was a great thing, and a sort of a loyal thing too, I guess. We were a 600-bed hospital, and we had a very busy time with many casualties. We'd have the ambulances coming, we'd expect them because our offices and our chief at our hospital would have that information, and we'd be ready. The operating room had to be ready for very many operations and emergencies, and I was in the resuscitation, and so we received the boys, and there were a lot of blood and plasma had to be given to them before they went into the operating room. So it was a very busy time, and the operating room was always ready, though. They were open all the time. Everybody helped everybody on the job or in the hospital, in our tents. If there was any need to stay on longer than our regular routine, we did do that to help one another. And we, I guess, just had to make your own fun as well, just in the camp ourselves. But there were times when some of the regiments or units would invite the nurses out if they were nearby, and we were able to be transported to have a visit with them or a little party. So that made a great deal of difference too. I think that all the nurses worked very, very hard, and they were very, very busy, and yet it was a very, very rough time too. But the nursing sisters were well looked after, I think, all the way through.
Tomorrow on CBC News World, our coverage of VE Day events in Europe continues. Starting in the morning at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, we'll visit the town of Neverdal in Holland, where there'll be special ceremonies thanking the soldiers of Canada's armed forces for their part in the country's liberation. We'll also go to London for a celebration in Hyde Park and a speech by the Queen Mother. Later in the day at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll have live coverage of Queen Elizabeth's speech in London. Then in the evening at 7 Eastern Time, News World presents a highlight package that wraps up the day's events in Europe. So join us again in the morning. I'll see you again tomorrow night. And as we leave you now, we leave you with some of the poignant pictures from today's VE Day celebrations in Europe. I'm Allison Smith. Good night.
With pride, the valor of our armed forces who brought us to victory. As head of the Commonwealth, I want to pay special tribute to the countries of the Commonwealth who, from the onset of war, were by our side.